Hello, and thank you for joining us. Today, we will be speaking with Fayrouz Sharqawi, who is the Director of Grassroots Al-Quds. Fayrouz, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you for having me.
So first, in a recent panel discussion on the Let's Talk It Over program hosted by Frank Barrett, which was held during the most recent bombardment of Gaza in May, you said that we were witnessing a new unity of the Palestinian people emerging through the mobilization and resistance against the Israeli attacks. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit about this, as well as if there was any reason in your view as to why this began to emerge at this particular stage. And additionally, about if you could speak a bit about what the situation is like now, a little over a month since the ceasefire went into effect.
Yes, well, first of all, the unity is not new, but it's kind of re-emerging
Mm,
now.
mm,
We have points in our Palestinian history where this unity was clear, like the two intifadas in 87 and in the year 2000. And the unity is felt again. During the last war on Gaza, which actually came after the continuous war on Jerusalem. I mean,
mm,
it all started with events taking place in Jerusalem, in Sheikh Jarrah, and at Damascus Gate, and inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And protests started being organized. And of course, whenever there are Palestinian protests, then there is a heavy crackdown by the occupation forces on these protests. And that is what what led to the reaction from Gaza and protests in the West Bank in support of Jerusalem, as well as in 48 occupied lands. I think that it is the result of a cumulative organizing, community organizing that has been taking place, networking and building again the bridges between the different fragmented parts of our occupied homeland. Palestinians in all over Palestine are different groups living different political realities as a result of the colonial divide and conquer policy. And I think that it is very good to see how Palestinians did not fall for this, and that Palestinians everywhere in occupied Palestine still feel and are aware that we are one people that are under one colonial project and one occupation. Um, I think that it is important for us to maintain and strengthen these links and these connections. These connections continue up till today, and we see still how Palestinians, wherever they can, are moving in between the different parts of occupied Jerusalem. Palestinians from 48 visit Jerusalem, they visit the West Bank. Palestinians from Jerusalem go to 48 occupied cities and villages to show solidarity and to protest and to visit other communities, show up for them in need. I think that we've seen beautiful examples of mutual aid and mutual support within the fragmented parts and also between them. And I think that it is very important that we keep it up and that we continue doing that community organizing. That is our way to full liberation and true liberation. Especially today, for example, now that protests are being organized in the West Bank against the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian Authority's oppression of the Palestinian people, we have seen people go out and protest also in 48 occupied lands, in Haifa and in Al-Fahm, in solidarity with the Palestinians in the West Bank. So to answer the question about how this unity is looking today, it's looking good. And I think that we need definitely to keep it up.
great, thank you. And additionally, we've seen very recently a new government come into power in Israel under Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. Can you speak a bit? What implications, if any, does this have for the situation in Palestine and the resistance?
Yes, this is a common question that I
Mm,
receive a lot, and it's a great opportunity for me to share the Palestinian voice and the Palestinian common understanding that the different Israeli governments are not different from each other.
sure.
Eventually, they all come under the same Zionist project. They have the same goals and they use the same policies. It's not like a government, a current government is going to be better or worse. I think that things get worse all the time. I think that what's important for people to understand globally is that the Israeli occupation authorities and the Israeli occupation state is becoming bolder and more shameless in its atrocities and its attack on Palestinians, because they keep saying that they get away with it. So things are getting worse when it comes to the policies and the oppression that the different and the consecutive governments are practicing against Palestinians. But I don't think that Bennett is going to be different than Netanyahu. I don't think that he's going to be better or worse. If anything, we have been witnessing in the last years a strong movement to the right when it comes to Israeli politics, and politicians are also becoming more openly racist and more openly fascist. And also the same goes for the Israeli legislation and for the Israeli policies and projects. And so I don't expect the Bennett government to be different. I don't expect it to be better or worse. Maybe Bennett is a bit more straightforward about his fascism than Netanyahu, but I really don't think that we should be comparing them or grading them. I think that we should be aware that for over 70 years now, the different and consecutive Israeli governments have been following the same guidelines and have been continuing each other's work. I think that when it comes, for example, to Jerusalem, where I am now, or where I live and work, the same policies and the same projects continue being implemented. There is no government that comes and cancels any of these projects. And again, we just expect that this colonialism and this occupation to become more vicious and to become more aggressive, as long as the so-called international community is silent about it. And I am talking about the governments around the world, certainly not the grassroots. But of course, also public opinion is important here.
Mm. So as I mentioned earlier, you are the director of an organization called Grassroots Al-Quds. Can you tell us a bit about this organization and the work that you do?
Yes, Grassroots Al-Quds is a Palestinian organization based in Jerusalem. We were established in 2011 to serve as a platform for Palestinian community mobilization and networking. We believe that the Palestinians in Jerusalem should be the ones and must be the ones leading their struggle for liberation and deciding the shape and the future and destiny of their own city. The way things are going in Jerusalem, or have been going in Jerusalem for decades now, show that everyone has a say and about the destiny and the future of Jerusalem, except for the Palestinians living in it. On the one hand, the Israeli occupation authorities have very clear plans for Jerusalem. These plans revolve and evolve around annexing as much land as possible in Jerusalem with as little Palestinian presence on them as possible. And for that, since 1967, then since the occupation of the eastern part of Jerusalem, the Israeli occupation authorities have been designing and implementing systematic policies of displacement against Palestinians. And so Grassroots Al-Quds was established in order to, first of all, support local mobilization around issues of immediate concern, and at the same time, and in addition to that, build networks between the different fragmented communities inside Jerusalem, because the divide and conquer policy happens on so many different levels. And even within the city of Jerusalem or the Jerusalem district, Palestinian communities are fragmented, they are disconnected, physically and non-physically. And I mean physically by the construction of colonies and colonial roads that are severing our communities from each other, and also non-physically because also on the Jerusalem level, different Palestinian communities face different types of displacement policies. And so our goal is to help also create Palestinian long-term strategies for Jerusalem, so that we stop only reacting to the occupation policies, but also envision the Jerusalem that we would like to live in and start working towards that vision. And so in order to do that, we first of all research Jerusalem. We research the history and the current reality of Jerusalem, of the different communities in the Jerusalem district. And we define Jerusalem like the whole Jerusalem district, not divided into east and west, and not stopping at municipal boundaries or at the wall boundaries, but rather the whole district with all 40 Palestinian communities in it. We believe that this knowledge and information is crucial as a tool for our community to mobilize and to strategize for liberation and freedom. And using this information, we support local mobilization. Like for example, right now, our local mobilization department is present in communities like Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, and helping with whatever we can, serving as a tool for our communities to mobilize and to advocate and to organize against displacement. But also at the same time, we build networks. So for example, we are working with different partners from all over Jerusalem on a tourism campaign, promoting tourism in the marginalized Palestinian communities, so that we build a sustainable economy that is crucial for our steadfastness, and to draw the movement again to the eastern part of Jerusalem, movement of tourists, so that also politically these tourists can see the occupation on the ground. We also have a global mobilization department. This department focuses on, first of all, sharing the Palestinian perspective on Jerusalem globally, but also on building networks globally with struggles around the world, not only with Palestine solidarity movements, but also with different struggles around the world: racial justice, social justice, economic justice, indigenous movements, and so on, because we do believe that these different struggles, even if they live different specific contexts, eventually we are all fighting the same enemy, that is globalized economy, that is corporationalism. And so we believe that it is crucial for us also to network and show true solidarity with each other, so that we can support each other's struggles everywhere we are based.
Absolutely, thank you. And as you've mentioned a little bit thus far, there's a very fragmented political reality and series of political actors within Palestine. Can you talk a little bit more about this and how you evaluate this political landscape?
Yes, these days are very important days and special days in the occupied 67 territory, speaking about the Palestinian Authority in specific. I don't know how much our listeners and viewers know about the events of the last few days, but on Thursday, the Palestinian Authority's police forces basically assassinated a Palestinian activist from Hebron. His name was Nizar Banat, and he was an outspoken activist and critic of the Palestinian Authority. And he had been arrested many times, and he had been tortured many times, and he never shut up. And that's exactly why the Palestinian Authority killed him on Thursday. And since Thursday, there had been, actually it was Wednesday night, and since Thursday, protests have been organized in the West Bank, especially in Ramallah, where the headquarters of the Palestinian Authority are. And Palestinians have been protesting this oppression of the Palestinian people, this killing of the Palestinian freedom of expression and of political opinion. And it's also important to say that, unfortunately, similar to the occupation forces, the Palestinian security forces have been viciously and aggressively attacking these protests and these protesters. And it's just a reminder to everyone that the Palestinian Authority is problematic. I think that people oftentimes around the world, people misunderstand the situation here and are misled into believing that the Palestinian Authority is the actual Palestinian political leadership, that they represent their people and that they work for our benefit and lead our struggle for freedom, which is a misconception. The Palestinian Authority was created in the 90s with the signing of the Oslo Agreement, and by default and definition, the Palestinian Authority is a collaborator with the occupation. People consider it as a traitor that continues its so-called security coordination with the occupation forces, which usually means prosecuting, arresting, and torturing Palestinian freedom fighters and activists and journalists that speak up against the oppression and the occupation. And so what we have been witnessing in Palestine in the last few days is a Palestinian uprising against the Palestinian Authority itself. And I think it is a good opportunity to remind everyone that many Palestinians see in the Palestinian Authority the first obstacle on our way to freedom. And people are already talking and calling for the dismantling of the PA, not the changing of the president, because that will not do. The problem is in the system itself. And so I think that right now, more and more people are aware of the fact that this political leadership is not the political leadership that the Palestinian people deserve or want. And to connect this with the events of the last 2 months and the unity we were talking about before, I think that it is time for community organizing to take full power and for us to start again reviving some of the phenomena that we used to see during the first Intifada. And I am talking about communities and popular committees that coordinate the uprising, that coordinate our needs and coordinate our struggle, for the people to take the power again and for the people to lead their own struggle for freedom. And again, in order for this to happen, we also need to get rid of the Palestinian Authority.
And additionally, as you mentioned earlier, the importance of international public opinion. In this context, I was wondering if you could speak a bit about your views on the international solidarity movements that we see taking place, especially these large protests we saw around the world during the last bombardment of Gaza, as well as the BDS campaign, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions campaign.
Yes, I think that solidarity with Palestine is important. I think, first of all, it is important to value the protests and the marches and the tens of thousands of people who went to the streets and called for the stopping of the Israeli occupation of Palestine and the stopping of the enabling of this occupation by their own governments, which is very important. I think that it is important to also look at this solidarity as a certain type of responsibility. Many times people talk about solidarity as if it is just charity to Palestine and charity to the Palestinians. It's not enough to simply donate to Palestine. It's not enough to come volunteer in Palestine for a month or two or a week or two. I think that people need to see the strong correlation between their own political reality and their government's foreign policy on Palestine. I think that people need to be aware that the Israeli colonial project and the Zionist colonial project in Palestine is enabled and funded by different governments and different corporations around the world. Governments that show diplomatic support unconditionally, and I'm not only talking about the United States, because the United States is usually the first name that comes to mind when we speak about international complicity, but other global north and global south, unfortunately, governments are also showing that support. In the last year, we have witnessed normalization with Israel by Arab countries, which is very sad and very outraging for Palestinians. And I think that this diplomatic support needs to stop, and it's people's responsibility to stop their governments from enabling this colonial project here in Palestine. But in addition, this support comes in the shape of money and funding and business relations, economic relations and arms trades. And I think that it is also people's responsibility to do a self-check and see which corporations from my country are invested in the occupation and profiteering from the occupation. There are so many international and multinational corporations that are physically present here on occupied territory. They have factories, they have relations and partnerships with Israeli companies. And it's important to see that this funds the occupation. And so this leads us to boycott. I think that boycotting Israel is a very important and crucial tool that people need to use around the world, despite the legislation and the mobilizing, official mobilizing against it within certain countries around the world. I think that people need to practice this right of expression and this right to say, no, not in our name and not with our taxpayer money and not with our consumer money. As long as you are making profit and enabling the occupation of Palestine, you will not get our money. And I think that it is a crucial role that people can play globally. And it's not just economic boycott. It should be also academic boycott and cultural boycott and sportive boycott on all different levels. I think that boycott and divestment are very important tools that need to be reinforced and need to be adopted globally. Again, despite the fact that there are already certain governments, especially in the United States and Europe, that are already legislating against it. And you know, sometimes I get so frustrated as a Palestinian speaking to foreign audiences, and I say, you know what? Even if you couldn't care less about Palestinian rights and about the Palestinian freedom, care about your own freedom, because I think that it's a very good mirror. The foreign policy on Palestine mirrors the level of freedom that people enjoy inside their own countries. And if people cannot speak freely for Palestine in a certain country, then their freedom is jeopardized. Their freedom is under threat. And so people should care about their own freedom. And if only hegemonic voices get to be freely expressed and other voices not, then there is a problem within those countries. And maybe we as Palestinians should start solidarity movements with them. And so I think that sometimes people just flatter themselves to be in the first world countries where they enjoy total freedom. I think people need to put a mirror in front of themselves and their countries and check and do that self-check. Are we really free?
Absolutely. And just to follow on from this too, the sometimes lack of understanding of the connection between domestic and foreign policy of these countries. They're completely entangled. But continuing on from this, you have spoken elsewhere as well about the value and necessity of internationalism, or the development of global links between different struggles and peoples around the world, as you mentioned also that Grassroots Al-Quds is focused on as well. Can you speak a bit about this further and share your thoughts about how these links might be developed or what such an alliance might look like today?
Yes, global oppression is not new. It's old news, and governments have been supporting each other in the past as well as today. But today, with globalized economy, as I was saying before about corporations being present in so many different places around the world and making money from the oppression of peoples around the world, and these big corporations and capitalism and imperialism in its new character, I think that these are mutual enemies that we have, all of the oppressed people around the world. And I think that it is time for us to realize that we need to unite in order to be able to defeat those forces. I think that we need to be aware of each other's political realities. I think that we need to learn from each other's experiences, history and experience, successes and failures, and to do this joint learning movement together so that we can also strategize together and so that we can support each other's struggles. I think that it is important that we do not see through only a narrow lens our own direct political reality, but see it as an integral part of a global scene that we all are living around the world. And we need to see that just like our enemies are united in oppressing us and violating our rights and killing our freedom, it is also necessary for us to join forces and to be supportive to each other. And again, the true sense of solidarity, and not just namely or verbally, but really, how do we build those learning structures? How do we mobilize for each other around the world? How do we go to the streets for each other? How do we, wherever we have the possibility, how do we influence our governments and their standpoints on different oppressions that are taking place around the world is very important for us. So just like oppression is globalized, I think that anti-oppression struggles need also to be globalized and connected so that we can together be successful.
Absolutely, our thoughts exactly. And finally, I was wondering if you can share a bit your thoughts on what Palestinian self-determination might look like today, or how that may be achieved at this juncture, and how what a resolution of the conflict might look like.
We have already touched on some parts of the answer to this question. I think, first of all, that we need to build those networks and build those bridges between the fragmented parts of Palestine. We need to stand up for each other. We need to be there and present for each other whenever and wherever possible. For example, today there is a brand new colony that is being built on Jabal Sbeh, which is near the village of Beta in the West Bank. And despite the fact that the struggle takes place there on the mountain itself, Still, we see people going out to protest for better all over the West Bank and in Jerusalem. We see people going from Jerusalem to visit Beta, to be there for them, to show true solidarity with our brothers and sisters. And so I think that, first of all, uniting the fragmented Palestine is one form of us practicing self-determination. I think that we need to resurrect again those phenomena that we used and those tools we used during the first Intifada specifically. And here is an invitation to people listening to us to look up the first Intifada and read about the beautiful community organizing that took place during the years of the first Intifada, where popular committees were coordinating the struggle, coordinating strikes, coordinating protests, coordinating food production so that we can be self-sufficient, coordinating the boycotting of Israeli products, coordinating homeschooling for kids that were losing school days because of curfews and strikes. These are all examples of how we practice that self-determination. And these are crucial tools today, again, in the shade of what's happening also under the Palestinian Authority and the continuous Israeli occupation and colonialism in Palestine. I think that in order for us to see true self-determination and freedom, we need, again, to take back the power. I think that we need to take the agency over our voices again. I think that we need to speak louder and clearer about Palestine being one homeland under one occupation, and practicing in the true sense that unity, so that we can together as Palestinians also envision the Palestine that we want. I mean, whatever I said about networking and envisioning of a free Jerusalem is true also for a free Palestine. And I think that it is very calming to see that we are already doing that, or that we are doing that again. Palestinians have their path clear in front of their eyes more than any time in the last couple of decades. And I think that what needs to be done is focusing on that, having clear visions and having clear ideas about how we reach these visions.
Great, thank you so much. I think with that, unfortunately, we have run out of time, but thank you so much for speaking with us, Fayrouz. Are there any final thoughts you would like to leave us with in closing?
I think that people need to be brave. I think that people need to be brave wherever they are. I think that unfortunately we live in a world today where it takes bravery to speak up against injustice. I think it takes bravery, individual and collective, to mobilize. And it's becoming more and more challenging, sometimes even legally, unfortunately, to speak up and to mobilize. But I do remind us all that it's important that we are not scared away, and that we are not terrorized into stopping, and that we should be stronger than ever moving forward.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.